I want to talk a bit about Babbling Loner. And first, I want to say this isn't me trying to talk trash about Babbling Loner. I like the guy. I agree with a lot of the things he says in his videos. For example, he has one video that's about losing passion in life. I forget exactly what it's called. I think it's like losing that fire and passion for life. And I think pretty much everything he said in that video was, I agree 100%. That was very on point. Everything he said there, I agree with. But I've been watching his videos for a while now, and I've seen probably, he puts out a lot of videos. I haven't seen all of them, so I don't have like the complete picture of all of his thoughts and everything. But specifically, there are two videos that he's put out now where I thought a lot of what he was saying was not very accurate, or it was very misguided, or basically I just disagree. I strongly disagree. So that's what I wanted to be talking about today. So I'm going to be responding in particular to two of Babbling Loner's videos. One of them is the video titled "We Already Peaked as a Society," and the other one is his video titled "Gen Z is Living on Nightmare Mode." Okay, because I think both of those videos, for the most part, kind of silly. And again, this isn't me talking trash about this guy. And if he's watching, Babbling Loner, I think you're pretty cool. Keep doing what you're doing. You're having a lot of success and you deserve it. Okay, you're making some good content. I enjoy it. And obviously, I'm not the only one. But with that said, here's where I disagree with Babbling Loner. Here's what I think he's wrong about. So in his video, "We Already Peaked as a Society," with the broad general point, I do agree that we have already peaked as a society, but most of the reasons he gives for that and a lot of the things he says in that video really is kind of silly, and it doesn't really make that much sense. So, for example, he says that people don't get excited about things like they used to. Nobody gets excited about the World Cup anymore. Nobody gets excited about Christmas anymore. And it's like, that's just because he's older now. Yeah, you don't get excited about Christmas when you're not a little kid. It seems obvious to me. And I don't know where he's getting this from, where his perspective on this comes from, but it's like little kids still get excited about Christmas, okay? If you think children are not still getting very excited about Christmas, then I don't know what to tell you. You're not living in reality at that point. Kids are excited about Christmas, okay? And the other thing he mentions, people don't get excited about the World Cup anymore. Again, that's just you. People do get very, very excited about the World Cup. People get hyped. That's just you. And that's kind of what happens to most people as they get older. Things become less exciting. So I don't know. It just seems just kind of silly to say that nobody gets excited about Christmas anymore. I promise you, a lot of people get excited about Christmas. Not adults, because grown adults are not the ones that Christmas is for. Not many grown adults get excited about Christmas anymore. That's because they grew up and they're not kids. Because when you're a kid on Christmas, you get a bunch of free things. But when you're an adult on Christmas, you either, you don't get that much in terms of gifts, but even if you do, you're also expected to spend a lot of your own money and give a lot of gifts. So obviously, Christmas is not that exciting anymore after you become an adult. So I don't think that has anything to do with our society or the state of our society. Another thing he says on the topic of Christmas, and this is like probably the thing that really set me off, that where I felt the need, like I have to make this video. I can't just like hear somebody say this and not say something about it, because it's, again, I like this. I like Babbling Loner. But this is just so retarded that I have to say something about it. He actually claimed that it is controversial these days for somebody to say Merry Christmas instead of saying Happy Holidays. Like that's some, like it's not politically correct to say Merry Christmas these days. This is something that, going back to, I remember first hearing people saying this back in like the year 2000, when I was like freaking like 12 years old or however old I was. Even back then, I remember hearing people saying, you can't even say Merry Christmas anymore. Nowadays, you have to say Happy Holidays. And it's just like, why do people say this? I don't know if that's just some kind of thing that at some point Bill O'Reilly or someone on Fox News made that claim and then a lot of morons believed it. But no, it's not controversial to say Merry Christmas. And in fact, a lot of major corporations, all these major corporations that truly have gone completely off the deep end in woke politics and political correctness. I don't disagree with that. But even like if you go to Walmart or something, or, like on Walmart's website on Christmas, they probably have a banner or something saying Merry Christmas. Okay? Nobody finds it controversial to say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. That is not a thing. If you think that is a thing, then you're probably very low IQ, or you have zero capability to think critically about things, or you're just like, something in your brain is broken where you're not able to have even a basic level of skepticism about things you hear. Because if you heard somebody say that it's controversial these days to say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays, that's not true. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. If you just open your eyes or just browse the internet or just, go out into the world and look around, you'll quickly realize that, hey, that's not true at all. Everything says Merry Christmas. Everybody's saying Merry Christmas. It's not controversial whatsoever. So, again, I do really like Babbling Loner's content. I probably agree with him more than I disagree with him. But just when I heard him say that, it was like, what? Like, what? How? I don't know how someone could say that with a straight face. I heard it's like, is he being serious? Maybe he was trying to just do some kind of deadpan joke. I don't know. But to act like, you can't even say Merry Christmas anymore. You can only say Happy Holidays. Just not true. Not true whatsoever. So what a ridiculous thing to believe. If you actually believe that, please take a second to just be present in the world around you and use your own observations and think about things. There's nothing controversial about saying Merry Christmas. There's not one person in this world that gives a damn about you saying Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. Nobody cares. It's not controversial. The most woke person in the entire world doesn't even care if you say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. Nobody cares. Nobody. So yeah, moving on. Something else he said in this video about we already peaked as a society. He talked about how back in the day, your neighbors would help you out if you needed any help, but nowadays, your neighbors they won't help you. And I do agree that over time, there has been in general, a declining sense of community and just how much people value their community and taking care of each other these days. It is on the decline. So I kind of agree with that point, but that's all been going downhill since at least the 90s. I mean, basically, once the internet started to gain traction, all that, community values and stuff, that's when that all started to decline. And it's really not even that much worse right now in 2025. It's not that much worse now than it was 10 years ago. Like the needle's barely even moved in that time period. But according to Babbling Loner, the peak of our society was in the 2000s. And he does specifically mention 2016 as kind of the turning point. So everything before that was kind of when our society was peaking. And after that, and he says especially after, the whole thing with that virus around 2019, 2020, that was kind of a turning point, that everything after that has gotten a lot worse. And I do agree with that as a turning point where things got a lot worse rapidly after that. But to say that our society peaked in the 2000s, that is a pretty outlandish claim. Especially to say that, the 2010s, to say that society was peaking in the 2010s, I don't think so. Like, not even close. It was already over at least by 2012, it was over. If you compare 2012 to 2022, not that much of a difference, honestly. In the grand scheme of things, yes, there was like a major shift around 2020 because of, whatever you think about it, you have to admit, because of the virus, there was a major shift in a lot of aspects of our society around that time. But by 2012, at the latest, it was already over at that point. And I think the reason that Babbling Loner, and he mentioned this in his video, but I think the reason why he thinks that things were a lot better in the 2010s, it truly is nostalgia goggles. That's just nostalgia. It's because you were young at that time, and I was still young as well, relatively, but I was already an adult. I was already in my 20s in the 2010s. So I feel like maybe that gives me a bit of a more clear perspective on things. But to say that society peaked in the 2000s is just insane. That's insane. I don't think Babbling Loner is insane, but I think his perspective is heavily painted by how young he was at that time. He would have been a kid in the 2000s, I'm pretty sure. And it's like, yeah, even kids growing up nowadays, they probably don't realize how over it is. You know what I mean? Because everybody looks back on the time when they were a kid, and it's hard to be objective about things because naturally most children have a optimistic outlook on things, and they think that that's basically the best time of their lives when they were a kid. Not everybody, of course. Some people have miserable childhoods, but in general, I think that is mostly true for most people. So I think his perspective on things is a little bit, it's not exactly accurate. Society peaked in maybe the 80s or the 90s. I think the peak of our society was before I was even born. It may have even been back in the 50s or 60s. The peak of our society was when you could just graduate high school, or maybe not even need a high school diploma, and you could work a very basic job. You could work minimum wage, or even before they had an official, federally mandated minimum wage, you could work at these very low wage jobs, and that would still pay you enough to afford to buy a house and support a family. And you could own a car, you could own a house, you would be respected by other people in your community just because the economy was booming. Society was booming. Society was peaking. But by the 2000s, especially by the 2010s, it was already almost at the bottom of the hill. Because like I say, things have gotten worse, but the difference between 1970 and 2005, that's a way bigger difference than the difference between 2005 and 2025. Okay, it like relatively speaking, things haven't even gotten that much worse since 2005. Like, yes, living through it, we can look back and say, like, yes, things have obviously gotten a lot worse, but the difference between, from 1985 to 2005, things got a lot worse, like more so than it is now. And I think that's something that Babbling Loner is, I think because of his age, he's just not able to see that. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Something else he said in that video, it's not really very important, but it's just something that stood out. He mentioned how there's no good role models anymore. And he talked about how he used to be a big fan of Ronaldo back in the day because Ronaldo was, he was all about just focusing on the game, just focusing on soccer. And nowadays, everybody's trying to be an influencer. Like all these athletes these days, everybody wants to be big on social media and everything. And that just stood out to me because Cristiano Ronaldo is literally the most followed person on Instagram. Not just the most followed soccer player, not just the most followed athlete. He is the most followed person, period, on all of Instagram. And he also has a big presence on YouTube. He even collaborated with Mr. Beast. So Ronaldo's really not a good example for what Babbling Loner was saying. I think a much better example would be Lionel Messi. That is a much better example of a player that, he just tries to stay out of the limelight and focus on the game. I am aware that there's another soccer player named Ronaldo that Babbling Loner might have been talking about the other Ronaldo, the Brazilian Ronaldo, instead of Cristiano Ronaldo. But I think most people, if they were talking about the Brazilian Ronaldo instead of Cristiano Ronaldo, most people would clarify that because Brazilian Ronaldo is not nearly as famous as Cristiano Ronaldo. And Cristiano Ronaldo is literally the most commercial-minded soccer player there is. Possibly the most commercial-minded athlete there is. Now, Babbling Loner did say a couple things in this video that I think are spot on. He talked about how video games are getting worse, and I agree with that 100%. Video games absolutely have already peaked. I mean, it is possible the video game landscape could get better again and could peak again, but it's looking unlikely. The whole philosophy behind video game design these days, especially coming from AAA studios, it's all about making everything as addictive as possible, loot boxes. It's all profit driven. I mean, they're trying to charge $70, $80 for a game, even more. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It stopped being about making a good game a long time ago. Now it's about making profit. So I think he was right about what he said about video games. And I think he's also right about how technological advances from here on out are not for the benefit of the consumer. It's not for the benefit of me and you. Technological advancements now, nowadays, and for the foreseeable future, it's all for the benefit of profits. Or when a piece of technology isn't solely for profit, then the other goals behind it is just to spy on us and harvest our data, which essentially that is also for profit one way or another, or it's for trying to control people. So I think he was right about video games and technology, but most of everything else he said, I think, was not very poignant. And it just seemed kind of, to say that society peaked in the 2000s or in the 2010s, that's really just ridiculous. That was not the peak of society, not even close. Now, the other Babbling Loner video that I had a few criticisms about is his video titled Gen Z is Living on Nightmare Mode. Now, it seems that his main thesis, so to speak, behind this video is that Gen Z has it harder than any other generation before them. And I do think that Gen Z has things tough. Gen Z was born into a society and an economy that's already on the downfall. And it's true that Gen Z, in a lot of ways, Gen Z never got to see a world that wasn't already completely screwed up by online dating and everything. I agree with the overall message. Gen Z does have it tough. But really, it was one thing that he said in this video that was just so off base that I wouldn't even mention this video at all if it wasn't for this one thing he said that just really bothers me. He said that millennials had it good, that millennials were enjoying some of the good times. Now, that is a truly ignorant statement, and it's just really very, very out of touch with reality. To say that millennials had it good compared to Gen Z is so astronomically out of touch. It's hard to even... I will say that a lot of millennials were positioned in a good time to buy property because most millennials did come into adulthood by the 2010s. By the 2010s, millennials, for the most part, were in their 20s. So theoretically, there are the most fortunate of the millennial generation were already adults and were able to make enough money early enough to purchase homes or purchase property before real estate values just ballooned out of control, which happened, I don't know, starting maybe 7 years ago, something like that. So that is pretty much the one benefit over Gen Z that I think some millennials had. But realistically, the majority of millennials that were able to take advantage of that situation, it was not the average Joe. That's mostly people that had family wealth that were able to purchase homes or purchase property in their 20s before property values just skyrocketed. And really, the thing is, millennials are similar to Gen Z in that millennials were also born after the world got all screwed up. There are a lot of older millennials, millennials on the older end that they will remember a time slightly before the internet screwed everything up, but they'll only remember that as being a part of their childhood. And that's how it is for me. I remember being a kid in the 90s. I remember being a young child in the 90s when things were a lot better. I remember my dad working a factory job, and we certainly weren't well off, but that was enough to give us a decent life. But by the time I graduated high school, shortly after I graduated high school, the Great Recession happened. And truly, since then, the economy's been screwed. Yes, we had a bit of a resurgence of the economy in the mid 2010s, I think around 2015, 2016, 2017. But I think it was all fake. The numbers, economic numbers and measures went back up and we're doing well again. But as far as, quality of life for the average person and the average person trying to find a job and everything, I think pretty much since the Great Recession, which was, I believe, 2009, everything's pretty much been screwed since then. There's a lot of people, a whole lot of people around my age, millennials, that were either graduating high school or graduating college. So basically coming into adulthood, coming into that stage of their life where you're supposed to be starting your career. And for a lot of us millennials, that coincided perfectly with the beginning of the Great Recession. The Great Recession, which, by the way, never actually recovered. It never really recovered. Everything's been shit since then. Okay, so to say that millennials were living through the good times compared to Gen Z, I don't think that Gen Z has it worse than millennials, but I don't think that millennials really had it much better, if at all. And I think it's ignorant to make that claim. So I had to mention that because it's just so wrong. It had to be corrected. Now, another thing he says in this Gen Z is living on nightmare mode video, he says that he believes that Gen Z is one of the hardest working generations. Now, that is just a laughable statement. Okay? I know I might get some flack from this because I have a lot of Gen Z viewers, and I know, if you make a video on YouTube and title it something about like Gen Z has it hard, Gen Z has it harder than any other generation, you'll just get tons of views. But if you make a video and replace the word Gen Z with millennial, you make a video, millennials have it the worst, millennials have it so hard, you're not going to get a lot of views. Okay, I understand that. I know that general YouTube audience is much more Gen Z than millennial. So some of you will disagree with this, but to say that Gen Z is one of the most hardworking generations is absolutely ridiculous. Gen Z is not the hardest working generation. They're probably one of the least hardworking generations. And it's not their fault. For most people, it's really not their fault. It's really just a matter of the world that they were born into. The conditions of the society and the economy that they just happen to be born into, being Gen Z. That made things very tough for them. And they have so much distractions on the internet and video games and all that. It's the conditions that lead to a person growing up not really valuing hard work and not really seeing any point in it. So there's a lot of people from the Gen Z generation, and just to be clear here, I shouldn't even have to say this, but I know that some people really struggle with nuance. I'm not saying that every Gen Z person is lazy or anything like that. I'm not saying that there's no hard workers in the Gen Z generation, because there obviously are. There are very hard workers in the Gen Z generation. But if we're speaking in general terms about the different generations of people, Gen Z is not the hardworking. They're not one of the most hardworking. And millennials aren't either. And boomers surely are not. Boomers were like the most fortunate generation of all time. I think that's safe to say. But think about like early 1900s, or I don't know really like when, but people used to work 80 hours a week, 12-hour days in the coal mines, getting black lung, catching different diseases. You know, there was children working in factories. Children worked full-time jobs in factories. Whenever all that was going on way back in, those were the hardest working generations. Gen Z is not one of the most hard-working generations. Millennials are not one of the most hard-working generations. Boomers sure as hell are not a hard-working generation. Boomers just lucked into everything they got. I don't think Babbling Loner would disagree with me on that, but Gen Z, I don't think that Babbling Loner is just pandering with the things he's saying. I think he's pretty cool, so I think he probably is just, that's what he believes. But to say that Gen Z is one of the most hardworking generations, if it was anybody else saying that, I would definitely think this guy is pandering to his audience. But I don't think that about Babbling Loner. But yeah, for the most part, I do really enjoy Babbling Loner's videos. So if any of you watching this, if you're not familiar with the guy, but you like my content, then I think you would probably enjoy his content too. So check him out. And yeah, thank you for watching.